On the afternoon of Sunday, February 25, 1855, 48-year-old Hannah Rallinson, her husband, and a group of friends hurried along a road in Sheffield, England. The group remained silent, deeply fearful of what awaited them. Following closely behind was a larger group, also heading to the same destination, though they had no plans of entering the building. This second group was merely curious and wanted to witness what might unfold. Despite feeling irritated and offended by the group trailing them, Hannah and her friends continued walking in silence. As Hannah walked, she couldn't help but wonder how she had ended up in this situation. At the time, Sheffield was an industrial hub with numerous metalworking factories. The city's population surged as people flocked to work in these factories. To accommodate the influx, the city constructed tenement apartments, which were cheap, crowded, and poorly built. Hannah and her husband lived in one of these apartments and worked in a factory. Already leading challenging lives, their difficulties escalated when their eldest son died in a coal mining accident, which devastated them, especially Hannah. In her grief, Hannah became very antisocial and began just going to the factory and doing backbreaking labor all day, and then came straight home. She would go to a room by herself, and she would just sit there all night and pray and try to communicate with her dead son. Now, at first, Hannah's husband basically did the same thing as Hannah. He put all of his energy, time, and his focus on work, even though it was totally backbreaking and miserable, but it was a distraction from the terrible grief he was dealing with. But after several weeks and months went by, Hannah's husband did begin to little by little get back to normal and began to move forward with his life. But he could see that Hannah was not. Hannah was totally depressed and isolated. And so he eventually encouraged her to start going back to church and start spending more time with people there, make some new friends, and hopefully being around some people will help her cope with this tragedy. And Hannah had actually taken her husband's advice. She began going back to church, she made a bunch of new friends, she rekindled old relationships, and before long she was getting that support, and it was helping her kind of move through this grieving process. But ironically, it was this new church support group that had thrust Hannah into a new horrible situation, one that was playing out on the streets of Sheffield, England, as Hannah, her husband, and her church friends speed walked down the road with this big group following behind them. The group included Hannah's husband, her closest church friend Harriet Ward, and 3 members of the Favell family, Mr. and Mrs. Favell and Mrs. Favell's sister. They were all heading to the Camp O'Lane tenement apartment, where Harriet and the Favells lived. Earlier that day, a heated argument had broken out in their church over what should be done about the Favell's basement. Some members believed that something dangerous was in the basement, suggesting it should be permanently sealed or that the building be demolished. Others thought the Favells were overreacting. The disagreement prompted Hannah, her husband, and their friends to leave the church and head to the apartment to prevent any rash actions from the other church members. As they reached the apartment, the group entered and locked the door behind them. Inside, they debated their next move, aware that the crowd outside was growing. It was like all these people were jockeying for position to get the best look. Hannah shut the blind in frustration and then walked back over to the group. And then, after a few minutes, Mr. Favell said, "If we're gonna do something in the basement, we have to get down there before the daylight is gone. We can't be down there in the dark." The group nodded because they understood why. They definitely did not want to be down there in the dark. And then Mr. Favell looked over at Hannah's husband and he kinda gestured like, "Why don't we, the 2 of us, go down there together?" Reluctantly, Hannah's husband agreed. Moments later, Hannah, Harriet, and the 2 Favell women watched as the 2 men opened up the basement door, turned around and looked at the women, and then, they slowly began descending the stairs. For the next 2 hours or so, the 2 men attempted to break up the stone floor in the basement, but all they found was dirt. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, becoming more restless. As night fell, Hannah became increasingly anxious about her husband still being in the basement in the dark. Finally, she called for the men to come back upstairs, and they returned, dejected and empty-handed. They had not found the thing they were looking for down there, which meant they had failed. But Hannah and her friends were hoping that, now that it was dark outside, and the people outside could no longer actually see into the basement because it was too dark, that, maybe, the crowd would disperse. But as Hannah, her husband, Harriet, and the Favells sat down to have some dinner in the apartment, they looked outside periodically and they saw the crowd was not going away. If anything, the crowd was still continuing to get bigger. This is Sheffield, England, in the 1800s. It was a tough place to live. Everybody's working at these factories, doing this hard awful work, 7 days a week, for very little money, and there's virtually no entertainment anywhere. It's basically just work, work, and work, until God calls you back. And so, when people in Sheffield saw this big group of people at night standing around this apartment window, it was exciting. And that was pretty rare in their lives. And so they were not about to leave and go home, because their lives at home were boring. By midnight, the situation became so tense that the Favels feared the crowd might break into the apartment. Mrs. Favell suggested covering the basement window to block the crowd's view, but no one wanted to go down there in the dark, and the entire thing turned into an argument between the group. And finally, Hannah, who recently lost her son, and was not in the best of moods, she just wanted to go home at this point, but she couldn't because of the group outside. She finally just snaps and decided to do it herself. And so she snatches the curtain rod and just walks right over to the basement door. She opens it up and begins descending the stairs before anybody else could stop her. And as she did, her husband and Harriet and the Favell family, they all crowded around the top of the basement stairs, looking down, waiting to see what would happen. And so, they all heard as Hannah turned the corner and walked over to that window, and they could hear her kind of messing around with the curtain as she put it in place. And then even though they could not see her down there, because the basement's totally dark, they can't see the window. After a couple of minutes, Hannah called out that she had finished and was coming back up, but then everything went silent. Seconds later, Hannah let out a horrible scream. Her husband rushed down to find her lying motionless on the floor. He carried her upstairs, where they tried to revive her. As they tended to Hannah, Harriet happened to look into the basement and screamed before fainting. The chilling controversy surrounding the basement had begun weeks earlier, at the start of February, when Harriet and the Favell family first started hearing strange and unsettling noises from below. At first, they brushed off the eerie sounds, attributing them to the natural creaks and groans of an old, poorly constructed building filled with tenants. But as the days passed, those noises grew louder and more persistent. By nightfall, they turned into haunting, almost otherworldly sounds that echoed through the walls, filling the air with an oppressive sense of dread. Harriet and the Favells were soon too terrified to venture down into the basement, especially after dark. Then came February 24th, a day that changed everything. It was just one day before Hannah and her friends were followed back to the apartment by a strange group of people, a prelude to the madness that would soon engulf them all. But before that fateful event, Harriet had experienced something far more terrifying. She had sworn she saw a ghost in the basement, an apparition of an old woman dressed in a flowing white gown, moving silently through the dim, dusty space. Harriet stood frozen as the ghost, pale and silent, kept pointing at a specific spot on the basement floor, her hand trembling with an urgency that seemed to transcend the veil of the living. That night, Harriet was plagued by a dream. In the dream, the ghost returned, standing in that same basement, pointing at that same spot. But this time, the spectral figure spoke. Her voice was a low, hollow whisper, filled with unspeakable sorrow and rage. She told Harriet she had been murdered, her precious gold stolen, and her body buried beneath the basement floor. The dream left Harriet rattled, consumed by a sense of impending doom. The following day, the church erupted in a fierce argument that lasted 2 hours. Harriet, Hannah, her husband, and the Favell family couldn't ignore the ghost's warning any longer. Determined to protect the Camp O'Lane apartment and uncover the truth, they stormed out, their faces etched with fear and purpose. A curious crowd followed them, thinking they might confront the ghost head-on. And in a way, that's exactly what Hannah, her husband, and their friends intended to do. Frustrated about the argument, Hannah ventured into the basement herself. Moments later, she collapsed to the floor, her body limp. Harriet, rushing to help her, soon fainted as well. When both women regained consciousness, they recounted their harrowing experiences. Hannah's voice trembled as she described what had happened. She had gone to the window, raising the curtain to let the crowd outside see what was happening inside. But when she turned back towards the stairs, her heart froze in her chest. The ghost was standing there, an old woman in white, her hollow eyes locked onto Hannah's, blocking her escape. The intensity of the ghost's stare sent shivers down her spine. Then, without warning, the ghost charged at her, its ethereal body passing through Hannah's in a cold, deathly rush. The sheer terror overwhelmed her, and she fainted to the ground. Harriet's story was even more nightmarish. After placing a wet towel on Hannah's forehead, she glanced up and saw the ghost slowly ascending the stairs. Its hollow eyes were fixed on Harriet, unblinking, full of menace. Harriet couldn't move, paralyzed with fear, as the ghost reached the top of the stairs and stood in the doorway, its face twisted in an expression of grotesque fury. Then, with deliberate slowness, the ghost opened its mouth unnaturally wide, the gaping maw of darkness sending Harriet's mind spiraling into panic. With trembling hands, the ghost began to remove its nightgown, revealing a body covered in deep, festering gashes and cuts, blood seeping from every wound. Harriet screamed in terror, and everything went black. When they awoke, the police had already arrived, dispersing the large crowd that had gathered outside. Finally, Hannah and her husband managed to leave the apartment, shaken but alive. But the terror was far from over. 12 hours later, Hannah would be dead. The Sheffield coroner conducted a thorough investigation into her sudden and mysterious death, but no scientific cause could be determined. The official cause of death was listed as fright. Hannah had literally been scared to death. In the wake of Hannah's inexplicable demise, Harriet and the Favell family couldn't bear to remain in that cursed apartment any longer. They packed up their belongings and left, their spirits broken. Other residents of the Camp O'Lane tenement soon followed, fleeing the oppressive atmosphere of fear that clung to the building like a dark shadow. To this day, no one has been able to offer a rational explanation for what truly happened in that basement, or how Hannah died. She had been in good health, and her death defied all logic. This case remains one of the few in recorded history where someone was said to have died purely from fear, a grim reminder of the horrors that lurked beneath the surface of Camp O'Lane, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon its dark secret.